Hi, my name is Jessie Roberts. I'm here to talk about an event that I work on in Australia. It's called Floatingland, and I'm presenting it today in the perspective of multidisciplinary collaborations and cultural change. So to begin with, about 21 hours flying time and at least 2 planes from Canada and a lot warmer weather lies a small little island continent that I call home, called Australia. And in the southeast corner of Queensland there's a small lake. It's called Lake Catharaba, and it sits in the UNESCO listed biosphere of Noosa. It's quite different to the lakes that you'll find in Canada. It's probably about 2 kilometres wide and maybe 6 kilometres long, so it's much smaller, but nonetheless it's quite a beautiful location. I work as the project manager and have, well, for the last 2 iterations of Floatingland I've worked as the project manager. And Floatingland hasn't always existed at this lake, but it's quite a beautiful site for the 10-day artist residency, which is at the core of the event. It may change in the future, but for now it's a beautiful spot that was quite inspiring for a site-specific artist residency and response to art in nature. So Floatingland is essentially, it's pivoted around a 10-day artist residency. It's framed and talked about as a conversation about art, culture and the environment. It brings together minds from varying disciplines. It brings together artists, scientists, academics, community, children in one space to have a conversation about potential new frames and potential new ways of thinking how the future may look and new ways of a collective sustainable future. These following images are essentially snapshots from the outcomes of the event. It's pivoted around the artist residency, so at the end of the event there's a series of installations. And apologies for the... I'll keep going actually. So these are some images from the last 2 years. There's workshops which strongly connect the installations and the artists to the local community. It ends in... there's performances. And we have speakers. So there's a series of platforms where people can engage in this conversation depending on where they come from and who they are and where they feel comfortable and where their tools are. I talk about Floatingland as a bit of a slime mold. I come from a science background. And for me, that's the perfect analogy of what it is. Floatingland is a platform for people to come together and share ideas and come up with new frames. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with what a slime mold is, but essentially slime molds exist as single cellular organisms and they live out in the environment. In response to a certain signal, they then come together in one big mass. They dissolve their cell walls, they dissolve their cell membranes, and their nucleus and DNA bombard in this big sack and combine, share ideas, exchange DNA essentially. They grow, they move around, and then eventually they form some fruiting bodies. And then those new combinations of DNA, those new ideas, those new ways of thinking shoot out into the environment. They go back and to live into their single cellular phase until the next cycle of signal comes around and they come back together. So Floatingland is a platform for people to come together, to break down their defensive walls and to share ideas regardless of where their perspective or their beliefs and where they come from. There's 2 key differences, although, with a slime mold and Floatingland. One is that a slime mold is all the same organisms, they all come together. In Floatingland we try and bring together as many different kinds of people as possible. And the second is that when you live out as a slime mold in your single-celled environment, you're rather unconnected from everybody else. So in Floatingland we try to develop a strong virtual platform that brings and allows people to stay connected and continue to communicate while they're out in their single-celled phase. This is my favourite piece from Floatingland 2011. It's generated from a collaboration between a sailor, a fibre artist, a bamboo and fibre artist, and a filmmaker. So the concepts, as you can see, this says the humanity if you can't see from back there. So it's a sinking ship where the sails have become projection screens. It was also coupled with sound, which of course you can't see at the moment or hear at the moment. So the concept and the frame that came from this collaboration, of course, wasn't possible with any of them working individually. It was only possible by their shared perspectives, their different ideas, their different ways of seeing the world. And more to that, it practically wasn't possible by any of them individually to build a boat with projection screens and sound. And it brings me to the basis of what we try and achieve, or the way we frame Floating Land as an event, and why we do it, and how we try and keep our perspectives. So we talk about multidisciplinary collaborations being a platform for us to generate new ideas and new frames, to connect concepts which were previously siloed, to come up with new perspectives that didn't exist before, and connect dots that were previously unconnected. So it allows us to come up with new ideas, new ways of seeing the world, and new ways of seeing the environmental problem and the environmental crisis, as this is the focus of Floating Land. So the basis is that multidisciplinary collaborations give us new content. And then a little deterrent, because I'll come back to this in a minute. But on one hand, we have the environment. I'm sure you've all heard of it. Apparently it's quite important. We breathe it, we eat it, all those other things. I won't go into it because we're all quite familiar with the discourse of the environment. And then on the other side, we've got people. You can decide which stick figure represents the artist and the scientist or the community. It's up to you. But you know, these people interact with each other, they create shared beliefs and shared patterns, and out of it comes a sense of, common sense of culture. But, we also interact with the environment. On an individual level, we interact with the environment, and then on a community level, we interact with the environment. And that relationship, and how we define and frame that relationship, from that we generate shared patterns, common beliefs, and emerges this sense of place. And out of that relationship and building on that sense of place emerges some cultural beliefs and cultural patterns. So in Floating Land, this is a quite simplified diagram, but basically we're trying to build a platform where new content can be generated, but more importantly, where community, where artists, where collaborators, where any person can come and explore those new frames. And in the process of exploring those new contents, they have the opportunity to redefine their relationship with the environment, to explore their relationship with their environment, explore their assumptions, and hopefully create a new sense of place and generate new culture or change culture. So that's the frame that we try and, that underlies Floating Land. Let me catch my train of thought. Floating Land is not only a visual delight, and it's not only a platform for intellectual food for thought. The element that I think is most powerful about Floating Land is that it provides a tactile and embodied place for people to experience and explore that idea of that relationship between culture and, myself and the environment. My best example of that, one of the installations that we had this year, how am I doing with time? Was an installation called Ghost Nets. There's often in fishing trawlers, the nets can be lost or cut out at sea, and these nets continue to fish the oceans and cause havoc and catch on coral reefs and continue to fish essentially, but they're masterless fishing nets, so they become ghosts in the ocean. Often they eventually wash up on the northern shores of Australia. There's a group of women in northern Australia that have taken those nets, combine it with traditional weaving to create art installations, to create awareness around this issue. This issue is quite easy to understand on an intellectual level, but the understanding that comes from taking that net and holding it in your hands and weaving it yourself and turning it into either a piece of artwork or a piece of functional basket is quite a very different understanding. So Floating Land creates an opportunity for people to have that physical and tactile understanding that exists without words and beyond words. And another example of the slime mould, before I go a little further, is that I was sitting on the shore this year with one of the installations, which was a combination of an atmospheric scientist and a kinetic artist. They were on their side over here and the ghost nets were over here doing a workshop with a group of young children visiting from the schools. The kids are there weaving their nets, they were building a giant whale out of the fishing nets. A couple of the children wander over, I'm sitting with the scientist, and they have an impromptu science lesson from an atmospheric scientist who's building do-it-yourself environmental sensors. So Floating Land for me is about that platform where different minds can collide spontaneously and you never know what will come out and what paths will cross. In 2011, Floating Land expanded the idea of ephemeral art for the first time to include digital media. So we brought lighting, projections and sounds to the event. For the first time in a natural environment, and as a project manager on the event it represented a few challenges, as anything in a remote environment does. These are a couple of the images. So as I mentioned before, Floating Land is connected with a strong virtual platform which allows us to expand the conversation beyond the 10-day artist residency and expand it to more than the local community but to a virtual community and a global network. In 2013 we've begun, so Floating Land is a biennial event. In 2013 we've begun the curatorial process of deciding exactly how it will run and the theme for next year, and we've taken the theme called Nature's Dialogue, which is inspired from biomimicry. I won't go into it too much, but Floating Land 2013 creatively explores the natural world's ancient practices and how it provides knowledge, insight and bio-inspired solutions towards a sustainable future. Again, we expand a work, the core of it is a 10-day artist residency. That's supported by a series of workshops, installations, speakers and performances. So particularly the artists that come and take the residency at Floating Land engage in community workshops throughout their stay, and this has a two-way dialogue. It means that not only the creative process is quite impacted by their engagement with the community, but the community has a greater long-lasting impact of the processes that happen on site. What's the other points that I wanted to say? We're expanding the virtual platform to have some online projects. So be a much greater component of the program than it has been in the past. Floating Land has continued to evolve throughout the last 10 years. So it began just as an outdoor sculpture event and has slowly evolved to include more and more and expand. So I'm excited about the virtual program and working with some international artists, and also gives us the opportunity to really try and address the environmental issues that come with festivals and events. How are ways that we can create performances, network performances, projects that are now global participation but without the global travel that is such a big issue of any kind of event. And I'm also excited about expanding the multidisciplinary element of it. So traditionally, Floating Land has multidisciplinary collaborations, but I'm looking forward to in 2013 with the theme of biomimicry, it allows us to really bring in the dialogue and the scientific mindset deeper into the conversation, which brings with it its own challenges. There's a certain level of challenges which comes from combining disciplines which are relatively close compared to when you get disciplines which are much further from each other, and how they can collaborate together. So Floating Land attempts to create a cultural change by enabling people a platform for the tactile exploration of their relationship with nature, and new frames that are possible and presented by multidisciplinary collaborations. The DVD for Floating Land is screening, where is it? The foyer of the theatre. Over the next 2 days, and those DVDs are also available for anyone that's interested. I have some of them here. Thank you for your time.